All right, well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Webinar on human flourishing. My name is Ellen Morgan, and I am the Principal Advisor for the Global Innovations for Character Development Initiative. Today's webinar is the first in a series of events over the next couple of months that will explore the distinct challenges and opportunities related to advancing the science of human flourishing. During today's session, we're going to be focusing on some of the key gaps that exist in flourishing science, and also the challenge of how to make the science of flourishing more representative of the breadth and diversity of human experience. Joining me for today's discussion are some recent TWCF awardees who have received initial funding to pursue research projects through the Grand Challenges in Human Flourishing Initiative. It's my pleasure to welcome today Blaine Fowers of the University of Miami, Carol Henry from University of Saskatchewan, and Melani O'Leary of World Vision Canada, as well as Toni Antonucci from the University of Michigan and Pamela Wadende from the University of Kisii. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll turn it over and ask you each to take a few minutes to tell us about yourselves and the research idea that you and your colleagues are pursuing. So Blaine, I'll turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you, Ellen, and I want to thank the Foundation for your support and encouragement. It's really wonderful, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about our project. I'm a professor of counseling psychology at the University of Miami, and in my background, I've been studying virtue and flourishing for over 20 years now. So this is very exciting to be doing this as a joint effort and to be reaching out more broadly to the world in the way that the Foundation is encouraging. Because on the one hand, we have universal theories and quantitative research that claims to be universal, but it's sourced almost exclusively in the US and Europe. So there's a risk of ethnocentrism there, and we even have to worry a little bit about an imperialistic approach to this. So it's very important that we rectify that and reach out more broadly to the world. On the other hand, a lot of anthropologists have provided rich indigenous accounts of flourishing. And they find that people are very willing and interested in talking about this. So we have this question then, is there anything we can say substantively about human flourishing? Is this something that comes down to various cultural expressions, or is there something that might be common to all of us as a single species? So that's the question that we'll be focused on mainly. And our intuition is that there is a meaningful, substantive, and useful theory of flourishing that could apply to all human beings. But that's still an open question, so we need to work it out. And we're going to study the question theoretically and see what kind of a concept we can develop. And then we're going to also test and evaluate that empirically by talking to a number of informants around the world to get their views on it. So in a nutshell, are there ways to think of human flourishing in general, or is flourishing necessarily and entirely a culturally bound concept? That's the question we're going to be focused on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Blaine. Carol, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carol Henry. I'm a professor at the University of Saskatchewan in the Canadian Prairies. My interest, and I also want to introduce my colleague, Melani, who is on the call, whom you're going to hear from. She is in Toronto, and so we're both sides of the Canadian provinces. I think Blaine has set up this quite nicely for us as we were looking at it, because for us, we're beginning to think about the dimensions of flourishing, and we think the common ones that we've heard is the physical, the social, the mental, and very much so the spiritual. But we've asked ourselves, are there other dimensions that should be included when we begin to think about flourishing? For example, when we think about cultural dimensions, when we think about people who are living in different socioeconomic circumstances, how do these factor when we think of flourishing? And I had one of the most interesting experience yesterday Because I was talking to one of my colleagues from the Northwest Territory, and in one minute I was describing flourishing, and in the next second when he picked it up, he was already at the government of the Northwest Territory thinking that this is something they would buy in because they're looking for ways to bring people together. And this resonates. And I was so excited that this is happening. So for us, we're taking a youth focus, the work that we do. We take a gendered approach, but also look at a youth focus, young people and their understanding of flourishing, their attitude towards it, and what makes them flourish is what we're beginning to look at. We're also looking at the role of partnerships and how these factor, and by partnerships, we're talking about communities, families, schools, how do these factor? Because we know that you're an individual, but around you are this many other dimensions, and flourishing is quite complex. And so we're taking that approach as we begin to look at flourishing. So our hope then is that we will gain a diverse understanding of flourishing using what we call a multidisciplinary, multi-sectorial approach.
Thank you, Carol. That focus on sort of the developmental perspective is really important. I'm going to turn now to Toni Antonucci. Please go ahead, Toni, introduce yourself and your idea. Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Toni Antonucci. I'm a professor of psychology and director of the Life Course Development Program at the University of Michigan, and I'm working with Pamela Wadende, who is at the University of Kisii. We want to take a non-Western view of flourishing. I guess we'd say there are two things. We're trying to get a non-Western view and particularly an African view, and we have the advantage of multiple collaborators in 6 different countries in Africa. And I think we'll say more about this later, but the most important thing we're trying to do here is to get perspectives from different cultures, and especially from cultures that have less of an individual approach and more of a community approach to human flourishing. Pam, do you want to add anything?
Thank you, Toni. Actually, you've said it all. I'm Pamela Wadende. I'm a lecturer at Kisii University. And as Toni says, we are working with 10 fellows from different African countries, Eastern Africa and Western Africa, and at different stages of academic development, early career researchers, mid-career researchers, and we are trying to look at human flourishing from multiple angles. And as Toni says, I'm going to talk about it later in the next session. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks again, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us for today. I'd like to begin today's conversation by exploring a little bit what is meant by flourishing. Unsurprisingly, there's no singular or really consensus definition of what it means to flourish. Flourishing has been variously described as a search for thriving, the pursuit of the good life, or even a state of ultimate well-being. If you ask different people from different walks of life what it means to flourish, you'll likely get very different answers. In fact, filmmaker Richard Sergey has actually done just this and put together a fantastic video, which you can actually view on the Templeton website. And I think the link will be posted into the chat. And yet, despite these different definitions and perspectives, flourishing itself seems to be, as Carol alluded to, a really widely understood term, and one that people, especially outside of academic communities, can gravitate towards. So my first question for our panelists is really, what is it about the term flourishing that you feel resonates with people? And do you think that there are elements of flourishing that are universal in the sense that they can be shared and sort of understood across cultures? So Blaine, I know that you guys have been thinking very deeply about this, so I'll turn to you for the first answer to this question.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. First thing I want to do is agree with Carol that flourishing is complex. no one who thinks about it very long will think of it as unidimensional. I think we need to think of it as multidimensional. But if we think about how it might be, there might be universal aspects of it. Two things about human beings, I think, two facts about us help to understand why it's so resonant, this term, even though there are many different meanings of it. The first one is that it's interesting about human beings that we have a lot of behavioral flexibility. And that's great because it allows us to make choices and to choose the kind of life we want to live. But it also means that we have a lot of uncertainty about what's the best way to live. So we have this open question for human beings about how should we live? And there are many different ways of doing that. And cultures and belief systems tend to provide quite a bit of guidance about this. But one of the interesting things about culture is that all human groups have culture. It's a universal aspect of our being. So we sometimes forget in looking at the cultural differences that it's something that everyone participates in one way or another. So a way to put that is that culture is an evolved feature of what we are as human beings. And that means that we don't have a fixed, straightforward pattern of the good life for everyone. So there are a lot of different versions of it. So that puts us in a position of being forced to choose and formulate what we mean by flourishing. And I think that's part of what's exciting about this project is to gather many different views and to see what we can make of those different views. The second thing I think about is that human beings also consistently and ubiquitously evaluate themselves and others and the world about them in terms of what's good and bad, what's better and worse. And so we're not neutral at all about the way we live. We're not neutral about how our life is going. We're not neutral about whether being treated fairly. All these things matter to us a lot. And so that mattering is a key feature of human life as well. We're just not blasé about whether we're living a good life or not. So I think the clue there is that this question is a key part of our flourishing. So one way of thinking about it is that it's not just that we don't know how to live well and we have to figure it out, but that we're continuously figuring it out and we keep changing our ideas about it. And so it's an ongoing project to figure out what flourishing means. But I think it resonates mainly because we just care so much about how our lives are going. And we have to individually and collectively choose ways of understanding that. And those things are constantly in flux. So it makes it a very exciting topic.
Yeah, thank you, Blaine, for that. I think this idea of sort of flourishing being a pursuit or a process is a really important one. Melani, I'd love to turn it over to you now to hear more about how you guys have been thinking about the importance of this term.
Yeah, I absolutely love this question because I think it speaks to why somebody like me outside of the academic world falls into this discussion, and I think that speaks to why it really does just resonate with people intuitively. And as we started to think through why it resonates, I think you can look at, going back centuries, humans have sought to try to understand what makes people happy. And I think one of the reasons that flourishing resonates with people is because it implies more than just being happy. Even just hearing the term, it comes with these easy associations related to physical and mental well-being, but very quickly a layperson can understand that it goes deeper into social connections and spirituality. And I think for us, ultimately, it's a non-technical term that everyone can aspire to. And coming again from a community development perspective, I think the term is a really important shift from thinking about survival to what are the enabling factors that contribute to people feeling successful and fulfilled in multiple dimensions of their lives, beyond these physical metrics of absence of disease, which what we often measure progress and success against in my world. And in fact, without even knowing about the field of human flourishing, World Vision at its highest level has articulated this organizational vision of every child having life in all its fullness. So clearly this pursuit of being the best version of ourselves and how we support others to attain it is something that, automatically resonates globally. And as our team started to unpack maybe some of these common elements that Carol has already started to talk a bit about, we really feel that there are common elements that are universal. And Carol started to talk a little bit about the perspective from the Northwest Territory, but we see that a lot of cultures have these locally defined concepts of well-being or notions and measures of a life well lived. And I think that this is another reason why human flourishing appeals to us and why it resonates with people across the world, is because it allows us to kind of anchor research and program design in local concepts and traditions, and how success is viewed from them. And I think very practically, you can see that across all cultures, there are shared characteristics from both an individual and collective perspective that are associated with a successful life. So I think Blaine also already started to talk a little bit about at the individual level. But as I started to reflect on it, I see, in our work, we often find themes of empowerment and agency across all cultures. And this idea of being able to define your goals and aspirations and then kind of measure how successful you are in being able to act on them is something that we see in every country that we work in and operate in. And I think that then also brings around these shared ideas. There are certain capabilities that are necessary to translate these goals into success, and then how to be resilient in the face of adversity. And then I think building from that, again, Carol had already talked about this sense of interpersonal dynamics and relationships that all cultures recognize as key contributions to well-being. So what was interesting for me as I was reflecting on this question is that, despite being in an unprecedented time of social isolation right now in the middle of the pandemic, and maybe perhaps illuminated by it, I think everybody is acknowledging the importance of meaningful social connections towards what helps people succeed. So I see all of these elements really continuing to rise up, despite which country you're sitting in. But what's really interesting for us is trying to understand, do we really know what these elements are for adolescents across the globe? Do we really know, for example, for adolescent girls, what does it take to flourish in their day-to-day life? And are those elements perceived the same for adolescent boys? Or are they wildly different between cultures and generations? And so, as we start to unpack this a little bit more, we're really excited to kind of dive into those understandings and see the elements that are common.
Great, thank you so much, Melanie. Toni, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about how you're going to be engaging with the idea of flourishing.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I agree with what the previous panelists have said, and I think all of these points are fundamental. What we like, and I think I hear it in their comments as well, what we like about the concept of human flourishing is it is non-technical, it reaches everyone, everyone can aspire to it. It has in its essence no culture burden, right? It doesn't say this is the only way to be to flourish as a human. At the same time, there is a tendency to impose one's culture, the dominant weird culture, for those of you who know that term, to impose our views on what we should and what other people are aspiring to. And what we want to do here, and this is why our focus on Africa, where there is so much less research of this kind, we want to look at the ways in which people who have entirely different cultures, who have entirely different views, well, not entirely, but a majority of their experiences are different from those of us, for example, in the United States or Western Europe. No one would argue that you can't flourish if you're not from the United States. Well, maybe some people, but they're not the people we want to talk to. But we understand the concept works for other people, for other cultures. We understand that everybody wants to aspire to it. And what we want to do is examine and inquire in other cultures exactly how people view human flourishing and how people within a culture aspire to it. And it's tricky. I mean, as other folks have already alluded to, what if and we haven't resolved this. We haven't hardly identified the complete reach of the problem. But for example, I was listening to a piece on the radio about early marriages. So what if in your culture, the aspiration is that all the girls get married by 15 and never go to school? Are they flourishing? Well, what do we do with that, right? Some parents might think that it's good because that means there's never going to be any danger of impurity. They'll get married very young and everything's safe. What do we do with that as a culture, as a world culture? And I don't know what to do about that. But on the other hand, we're going with a more positive view, which is you can come from a culture where you flourish if you contribute to your community, if you give up an individual goal for the benefit of the community. And that is the kind of thing that we could all aspire to, right? We want our culture and our community to flourish. And finally, I'll just note that we are living in very difficult times. I mean, we all know that. We have the pandemic. You guys not in the United States didn't have to go through Trump, but I mean, most of the people that I know, even people who supported him are suffering from a backlash. And we have, I don't want to go through a litany of it, but in our world, no matter what world you're in, you know that there are things where people are suffering. We know people who have been sick. We know people who have died. We know people who can't get a job, who have food insecurity. So we're in a very non-flourishing time. And the question is, can this research do us any good, help us in any way to come back from that, to redesign our future? I mean, I don't want to sound grandiose about it, but to help people rethink how they face the future rather than face it only while feeling bad about things that are happening in our own culture and at the global perspective. So I'll stop there. I could go on about this, but that's why I think this research is very important. And if I have gone over, I know Pam's going to pick up on these in the next round of responses.
Great. Thanks so much, Toni. I think what you were saying at the end there about the importance of hope for a flourishing future is really key. And I hope we can get into that a little bit more later. To take a step back for a moment, I guess I just want to share with our audience that, as some of you may know, over the past sort of year or so, Templeton World Charity Foundation has been engaging with researchers, funders, practitioners, and others who are working on ways to advance the science of human flourishing. And through these conversations, really 3 key gaps have emerged. The first is a knowledge gap, which essentially just refers to the fact that both conceptual models, as well as the type of scientific data that we have, which informs current understandings of flourishing, are generated primarily from a small subset of the global population that, as Toni mentioned, is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, or in other words, weird. Now, this is a phenomena which Joseph Heinrich has written about in considerable detail, and it has profound implications because it means that a lot of what constitutes scientific knowledge is based on a very specific cultural context. Similarly, there's also a methodological gap, which essentially refers to the fact that many of the tools and methods used to measure flourishing have not necessarily been validated in diverse contexts and almost always tend to privilege the individual rather than the collective as the unit of analysis. And while there are important efforts underway to address this gap, it remains a critical challenge going forward. And I know many of our panelists have spoken about this as an important aspect of their research. The final gap I want to talk about is really a structural gap. And that just refers to the reality that a lot of the funding for scientific research on flourishing or underrepresentation of researchers from the majority world, or even sort of barriers to participation from diverse communities, especially those who are facing sort of chronic adversity. Now, this challenge isn't one that is necessarily specific to flourishing science, but I think it's a critical dynamic for those of us working in this field to take into account and to work to address. And so this brings me to our final question for the panelists for today, which is, what do you feel are the biggest gaps or challenges to advancing the science of human flourishing? And how are you hoping to approach some of these in your work? So again, Blaine, I'll turn to you to start us off.
Okay, thank you. As we've studied the scholarly literature on flourishing, we've found exactly what Ellen talked about. And there are two really clear things that we're going to try to address with this to work on this theoretical gap that she mentioned. So there are several really well articulated, interesting models of flourishing, whether you're talking about from Vanderweel, from Seligman, Diener, Keyes, Riff, and several others. And these are really smart, prolific researchers, and I don't want to be terribly critical of them. And yet, they all say that their models are derived from, quote, a thorough review of the literature, unquote, and from a variety of world knowledge and wisdom sources. But what you notice right away is the models are different. They're not the same. So somehow, however they're getting to this literature, whatever they're coming to it with and taking away from it, they come with and take away different things. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, they're all strikingly similar in that they all tend to have this North Atlantic cast. So the models are presented in such a way that they make a lot of sense to people in the US and Western Europe, but then they don't really fit well around the world very well. A second thing that comes clear is that these models kind of float in the air. They're not really grounded in anything that gives us confidence in the understanding that they're presenting. So they don't have much in the way of philosophical or meta-theoretical bases, and they sort of seem to express the intuitions of the authors rather than something deeper or broader. So we're going to use two resources to try to address these theoretical gaps. One is Evolutionary Science, and the other is Aristotle's Ethics. Now, those are going to sound like they don't go together very well, but when you look closely at them, they are remarkably complementary. So we're going to take that as our beginning point and see what we can make of it. The advantage of evolutionary science is it gives us a scientific way to try to deal with this idea of human nature rather than just an intuitive way. And then Aristotle's Ethics is focused exactly on the question of human flourishing. That's what he wrote about. And everything else he said had to do with that. And by the way, people forget that he wrote a book called The Politics, and the Nicomachean Ethics, his primary ethic book, is the one where we get most of our ideas about virtue ethics. But the ethics is an introduction to the politics. And in the politics, he says that communal well-being is the most important thing, and everything else flows from that. So just to give you a little bit of an idea about, he was a broader thinker than he sometimes gets credit for. This term flourishing largely comes as a translation of the ancient Greek term eudaimonia. There are other ways we get to that, but that's the way that most people get to it. We may not realize that that's the root of it, but that's where it comes from. And so Aristotle was all about eudaimonia, or living well as a human being is what he meant by that. We're also going to address the gap that has to do with the structural gap, as Ellen called it, because we want to go beyond North Atlantic thinking, and we want to deal with broader views of flourishing. And there have been some efforts to do what's called cross-cultural research, but what those have primarily been is people take the models that they developed in these elite institutions in the North Atlantic, and they just apply them to various cultures. They bring their theories, their models, their measures, and they will translate the measures, which is great, but it's still the same brand of thinking. And so I think we need to broaden that and get more input from around the world. if we want to have a really global understanding. So we're going to be instructed by people from around the world. And one way to understand our perspective is that it's going to unfold in a dialectic between flourishing as an expression of human nature and flourishing as an expression of being a cultural being, cultural creatures. So that's what we're going to try to do. I think that's going to have a lot of implications for the methodological gap too. We're not going to focus as much on that, but I think we're going to learn a lot about the ways we need to study flourishing if we're going to truly take a more global perspective.
Wonderful. Thank you, Blaine. Carol and Melani, would love to hear your thoughts on this. So I'll turn it over to you.
Melani, do you want to start?
No, go right ahead, Carol.
Oh, okay. So Blaine, agreed totally. One of the things when we, as you know, we're taking a community development approach. And the one thing that we've always learned is that the whole is greater than the sum of its part. And so we want to really engage the communities in which we are working. And we started out by looking at communities in the global south as well as the global north. And these are communities. We worked in the global south. We are beginning to work in the global north. But we're learning a lot about flourishing and about what the good life means for them. And I think in terms of looking at the knowledge gap, one of the things we did was to look at the makeup of our research team and invite other team members who we felt could bring an understanding of flourishing from an Indigenous perspective, from a traditional perspective. And so she said, great what you're doing, but here are some of the things that are missing. And so we are looking a lot at the traditional Indigenous theories to see what we can learn from them. That's really help to broaden our understanding of human flourishing. Most of us are somewhat very familiar with the traditional or the Western view. This gives us an opportunity to do that. Also gives us an opportunity to look at youth though, because when you think about adolescents, they are the generation, one of the largest generation in history, and yet they're not studied in this way. I can see when I go looking for flourishing, I see a number of publications, but none on adolescent flourishing, are very limited. And this gives us an opportunity to ask those questions. What are the gaps here when we begin to think of the adolescent, how they flourish? And the thing that is always interests me is not just how they flourish now. As Blaine said, it is a process, because is it going to be different within the different adolescents group? And as they grow, will we see changes? So let's understand those attitudes to flourishing. And so that's one of the things I think we're doing when it comes to the knowledge gap. When it comes to the structural gap, again, for us, I think an important part of that is to look at the structures around, or if we take the socio-ecological model, we realize that within the circle is the individual, but there's so many other factors that influence that individual's good life. When I wake up in the morning, it's not just simple because I'm happy and smiling, but it goes a long way for the people around me. Some of you, Helen, know that we had an election last night, and that also influenced the way I woke up this morning. So there are a number of reasons for us to not only look at the individual, but to look at what is happening. And to this end, within our structure, the first thing we look at is who are our advisors? what can we learn from researchers who are not part of our smaller group? What can we learn from community advisors? What can we learn from adolescents themselves? And if we begin to look at those advisors, I think, and not just within our own small units, I think that we will find that there's a lot more there when we begin to tease flourishing. As I said, when I spoke to this young man, immediately he grasped it. It took me a while, but he grasped it in 1 minute and he was ready to run with it. When it comes to the methodologies, I think for us, and the other thing I didn't talk about, and Melanie can talk about that, is this gender transformative theoretical approach that also becomes one of the backbone. And I'm going to leave that for Melanie to talk a little bit about the gender transformative. The methodological are important for us because we've always believed that participatory approaches are great. And they take a longer time, because you've got to listen to everyone. But this is the approach, these are the approaches we're taking, listening to the voice, giving voice to the youth that are vulnerable, the youth who normally may not have a voice. We want them to be part of the research, and not just to tell them what to do, but to participate in the design, to participate in the implementation, and to be there. So participatory approaches is what we're looking at. We're looking also, and if you notice, we're just all over the place trying to find what fits. We're taking a strength-based approach that is easier said than done, because most of us talking about focus on the strength, and yet when we get to the research, we do the deficit. But that's where we are looking at the partners who are going to assist us. We're also looking at the relationship building and how those, the whole idea of trust and trust building, and how that might be something we can look at as a potential indicator of the success of this framework, how this framework will be measured. And then we're looking at mixed methodologies, both quantitative and qualitative. We're finding also that just simply doing a survey is not enough. There are a number of other quantitative approaches that we've used in the past and would nicely fit into this. We're looking at that. We're talking about the Indigenous leaders, the thought leaders, and how they may guide our understanding. Because you know that when we talk about human flourishing, it may be flourishing to us, but to these leaders, they've used it in the past and they can help to guide us. And then we're really looking at the context that when you think about human flourishing, it's linked to everything in our lives. Melanie sent me quite quickly human flourishing and the food system. And so we coined the communities, the nourishing communities, because we know that nourishing communities are sustainable and they are the ones that are going to help the youth. So I'm going to pause and give Melanie a little bit of time to share from her perspective.
Thanks. I don't have a whole lot more to add other than to say, I think you've really hit on, one of the things we're most excited about is actually involving adolescents as co-researchers with us. I think the qualitative and participatory approaches that we've selected to test within this framework is really to bring in those voices, adolescent voices, which really seem to be missing in a lot of the literature that we've been going through. And I think it's really important that they're the ones speaking about their perspectives for flourishing. So we're really excited about particularly bringing youth along with us to design the research and unpack it themselves. But as Carol said, one of the things we're also really interested in, maybe an additional lens, is really just understanding the gendered experiences that happen among adolescents. And I think actually Toni was talking about the early marriage, and this last 2 years in particular seems like an unprecedented period of adversity. And we know across the world that women and girls face discrimination in many areas of their lives. And so we're really just trying to understand, as we're looking at adolescence, what elements related to agency and decision making and abilities to translate goals into accomplishments, what elements are gendered experiences? What does this mean for girls in particular? And how do we identify that within a theoretical framework of flourishing, but also then how do we design approaches to overcome that, those chronic adversities? So yeah, we're looking forward to unpacking that a little bit more as we go.
Wonderful, thank you, Melani. That was really important to highlight, I think, the importance of different identity characteristics when exploring this type of work. I'll turn now to Pamela. Would love to hear your thoughts on the key gaps and challenges that you and your colleagues are facing when starting to undertake this work.
Thank you very much. Please forgive my dark background. We are in a power outage, so I'll just take it from here. So I agree with the panelists who've spoken before me about the gaps. Yeah, those are really glaring gaps that need to be plugged. So I'll straight away go talk about how we look at these gaps, how we plan to bridge them. So I'll start off with the knowledge gap. So we plan to bridge this gap by working with 10 professional development fellows from West and Eastern Africa. Now, these are fellows who were competitively selected for the ISSBD Jacobs Foundation Professional Development Program. Now, through them, we aim to collect ideas about human flourishing from several African countries, representing diverse cultural backgrounds, both within and across countries. We acknowledge that this will be by no means represent the African continent or the majority world, but we see it as an opportunity, an appropriate starting point or preliminary steps to guide our pilot. Now, our team is also surveying the human flourishing from a developmental angle. We will take advantage of the expertise of our diverse members, the professional development fellows, and examine human flourishing at different developmental stages. These professional development fellows, some of them are in the early childhood care, some of them are in adolescence. Their areas of expertise is adolescence, some are in adulthood, some are in old age. So we have this whole group that is going to help us bridge this gap by looking at human flourishing from all these perspectives. Now, onto the methodological gap. The 10 fellows are from different academic fields. And the academic fields represented by these fellows that we are working with, I being one of them, includes educational psychology, early childhood education and care, as I said, philosophy, developmental psychology, maths education, instruction, and special education. So each will approach the area of human flourishing from the academic area of expertise. So from there, we expect to get various methods of looking at this human flourishing. Now, this will allow us an opportunity to view human flourishing from diverse perspectives as represented by these fellows. Now, onto the structural gaps. The Templeton World Charity Foundation donation has enabled us to bring underrepresented, specifically African voices to research in the field of human flourishing. Now, since our project will be conducted in Africa, predominantly by African scholars, we hope to fill this gap, but we still recognize that we'll not be talking for the entire African continent because we are only representing 10 countries. 6 countries, but we realize, I hope I wasn't lost. We realize we are not representing the entire African continent. So we firmly believe that representative science is good science, and that with greater diversity of findings,
will be contributing to the knowledge base in human flourishing. I know I don't look a lot like Pamela, but this is one of the problems we deal with. There's always power outages. Though funny, I had one today, this morning. And I know we're short on time, so let me just add, one of the things that I think she was going to say about structural gaps is that we're getting the diversity of perspectives from 10 different scholars, but even and that doesn't represent all of Africa, but even within their regions or countries, what's happening is we have multiple languages. So we're talking in English, that works nicely, but we often, hi Pam, I'm just pretending I'm you. So pick up.
I'm back.
Okay,
I'm back. Sorry, my connection.
Go right ahead.
Yes, thank you. So we firmly believe that representative science is good science, and that with greater diversity of findings, we'll achieve a better understanding of the concept of interest. In this case, it's human flourishing. Now, since our project is divided among 10 fellows and 6 countries, we are hopeful that our pilot data will provide important insights on the concept of human flourishing that will enrich the data available already from the weird countries. I'm spelling that. Further, we anticipate that it will provide the basis for a detailed, expanded project on human flourishing with representative samples throughout Africa, building on the strengths of human flourishing in Africa and potentially developing programs that will support human flourishing in various contexts. And that's really how we think we are going to bridge the structural gap. Thank you. Toni, would you have anything to add?
I was just in the middle of saying that even with our 10 scholars in Africa, representing 6 different countries, I mean, even as we choose and are beginning to pilot instruments, the instruments have to be translated into multiple languages within the country, tribal languages, regional languages, et cetera. So, I mean, it is a pretty significant task we have set for ourselves, but I think all of the team believes that there are some core elements of human flourishing that we will be able to identify.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Toni and Pamela, and also to the rest of our panelists. We have a few minutes left, so I would love to turn to the audience for some questions. There are 2 that have already come up that I'll read out. And please, this is an invitation to the panelists, speak up as you wish in order to answer these questions. So the first one I have is, well, this one is actually directed at Carol, so I'll call that out. But flourishing in youth is so important. And this person wants to know about the importance of the human flourishing concept in doctors specifically. So how does it differ from the more commonly utilized domain of wellness? Do you think that striving for human flourishing would be a more comprehensive goal rather than wellness?
Very interesting. So, and I will ask my colleague Melani also to speak, but when I think of wellness and the way we have looked at wellness, health and well-being, we've focused a lot more on the mental, the physical, and we haven't always taken the holistic approaches, including the spiritual well-being. And I think sometimes we try to avoid that, because to think of the spiritual well-being means that we're looking religiously or we are looking at alternate health systems. But when I saw flourishing and began to look at it, that was the thing that attracted me, that there's so many aspects to the spiritual well-being. So I think that's the part of it for me that comes out more strongly in flourishing. And I think you're right that it is a process. It isn't that today I'm totally excited, things are going well and I'm flourishing. And yet you ask the question then, what about the engineer that for 3 years lived on the streets in Toronto because he lost his job, wasn't able to find one, and then somebody gave him a chance and he moved on. So it seems to me that this whole area of the good life and what that means to a young doctor in here in Saskatoon once said to me, I grew up in Africa and I didn't know I was poor until I came to North America, because our understanding of poverty is so different. So how people flourish and how youth understand flourishing, the love of their parents, the joys that surround them. They may not have a lot of funds, but that to me is part of how we understand flourishing. So yeah, for me, I would say that the spiritual aspect of it, that holistic look at flourishing, makes it for me a bit different from simply saying well-being. Melani, thoughts?
No, I think you've done a great job, Carol. I think just to answer it, that I think from a doctor's perspective, we often, and I'm not a doctor, but I work in health, so it's often the absence of disease. And I think even those elements, Carol, that you brought up around mental health is not typically associated within a wellness checkup, right? So I think that shift to a terminology of flourishing gives mandate, and perhaps even within a screening or checkup format, to understand other dimensions of wellness. So yeah, absolutely. I think it would do us well to shift from a Western medical perspective of wellness to something that is more holistic.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Yelena, for that question. The next question I have is directed at Blaine. Dr. Fowers, this person would like to know in what ways you will be using evolutionary science. So are you going to be pulling specifically principles from evolutionary psychology?
That's a great question. I really appreciate it, because when I use those terms, people have often a very stereotyped idea about it. But one of the things that I notice about evolutionary science is that it is actually quite diverse. There are a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives that people come from. It's a multidisciplinary kind of enterprise from the beginning. And so I think evolutionary psychology is important, and part of what we learn from that is that there seems to be certain modes of being and modes of mind that human beings have, and that we'll want to pay attention to those and follow those threads through to how do those modes either contribute to or undermine the possibilities of flourishing. But one of the things that's been talked about an awful lot today, and I think rightfully so, and it's something that I'm very excited about, is the idea that human beings are inherently social beings. We're deeply social. And so it's not as though we're individuals first and we add social layers onto that. What we are as individuals is based on where we find ourselves socially. So we're shaped right from the beginning, and we would be very different depending on the different backgrounds that are possible. So I think that's got to be factored into any concept of flourishing, and I think it is in almost all cases. And then we have to figure out the best ways of understanding ourselves as social creatures. So the answer is yes, but it's a qualified yes. And I'll also add that what you get with me is a neo-Aristotelian interpretation of evolutionary science, and it might not look that evolutionary to some people. So I have my own way of doing this, and I'm going to be very interested in input from a lot of sources. While I have the floor, let me just admit that I've been remiss. I have not acknowledged my wonderful co-PI, Gerda Nicola, who couldn't be here today, but she's very important in what we're doing, and I could not do it without her. So I want to make sure and give her a shout out. But anyway, that's just a brief answer to your question, Jennifer. And if you have further questions, I'd be happy to talk about it more.
Great, thanks so much, Blaine. We've got 2 more questions in the queue, which we'll try to address in the next 5 minutes. So I'm going to turn first to this one, which most of you can probably see in the chat from Isabella Granick. She's asking that, especially for those of you who are focusing on adolescent flourishing, I'm wondering if you're going to ask youth about their digital contexts and how they're using them to build new forms of collectives that go beyond the physical instantations of community that we're more used to researching. So I'll leave that open to anyone.
I think Melani has answered it in the chat, so I'm going to let her do it openly.
Yeah, I did put a quick little piece in there. I think it's an element that we're really keen to understand for adolescents because it is such an important part of their lived reality right now. So we're exploring that in a couple of different ways, in addition to this idea of digital collective groups. We're also hoping to leverage different social media platforms like Clubhouse and other areas where we can actually engage youth in those communities to understand what flourishing looks like in the communities that we're participating in online. So yeah, it's something that we really would like to understand a little bit more.
And we're also using photo voice photography and how that's going to help us also to work with those voices that normally would not be heard.
Great, thank you for that really important question. Turning now to, I think, the last one that we'll have time for today. This is a question about the philosophical groundings proposed for human flourishing. Specifically, do you think that drawing from diverse philosophical foundations from contrasting cultures should be a priority for this research program? And again, I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to answer. This is from Charlie Wu.
I may have been the only person who used the term philosophical, so I should probably start. I think it is a priority. Now, what everyone has acknowledged here today, and I feel the same limitation, is that there's only so much that any finite group of mortal beings can do. And so it sounds like a great idea. I'd love to see a lot of it. I do know one philosophical tradition pretty well. I've studied it for decades now. And so that's the one I'm going to rely on mostly, but I'm certainly open to input from a variety of sources. And I'm sure that as we talk with people, there will be contrasting philosophies voiced, and we'll be very interested in hearing how they raise new questions, open up new possibilities, and or harmonize with the one that we're bringing. So, and I've mentioned Gerda as well, but she doesn't share my fascination with Aristotle. She has her own viewpoints, and so there's a little bit of diversity in our team. But I can't, by any stretch, claim great diversity in philosophical backgrounds within the team. We have a certain amount, but it's limited by us as human beings. We're only capable of so much. So I'm hoping a lot of people will contribute. There'll be a lot of voices in the conversation, and that can enrich us more so than trying to cover all the ground myself.
And I'll just add to Blaine, as he said, I think that's super good. That's what we're thinking in our current group. We're community-based scholars, but we're always open and we're looking for those voices that are not present. And that's what we're looking for, the philosophers, to help us to tease this out. So as we continue to develop our advisory group or team, that's something we're looking, because we feel strongly that those voices need to be included.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to wrap it up as we're running out of time, but this has been a great discussion, and we really appreciate sort of all the insights from our panelists and also those of you who have joined today. I want to point out that this is actually just the first in a 4-part series on the science of human flourishing, and next week we'll feature 3 more awardees from Templeton's Grand Challenge, who are going to be sitting down in conversation with Dawid Potgieter, who's the Director of Programs and Discovery Science at the Foundation. They're going to be focusing explicitly on the stories we tell ourselves and others as humans, the importance of listening well, and the role of emotions and promoting societies that flourish. So we hope that you're also going to be able to join us then, and also tune in for parts 3 and 4 that are upcoming in October. For more information on any of these events, please sort of join our mailing list or check out our Facebook page, other social media at Templeton World Charity Foundation. There's going to be a lot more information there. And thank you once again to everyone who's joined, and we'll look forward to getting together again soon.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.